We were, frankly, shocked to find how far ahead of us they were. Wind tunnels, to start with. In the whole of the Allied aviation world, there wasn't a single supersonic wind tunnel.
World War I. High above the clouds, Germany's Zeppelin fleet sweeps into British skies. Packed with bombs, these menacing airships prepared to unleash another assault on London. With no suitable interceptors, Britain is powerless to stop them. To counter the German airships, Britain develops a hybrid aircraft, the twin Blackburn twin, a Zwilling design welding the fuselages of two planes together. With double the engines and extra fuel, it is hoped they have a chance of surprising the Zeppelins hiding amongst the clouds. In World War II, Germany and the US, looking to make the most of their precious wartime resources, build up their own Zwilling forces. Heinkel's towing aircraft, the He-111Z, Dornier's heavy fighter, the Ju-635, Messerschmitt's escort fighter, the Bf-109Z, and North American's F-82 Twin Mustang. This is the story of the birth of aviation's deadly twins. By the middle of the Second World War, strange shapes started to appear in the skies over Germany. They were state-of-the-art aircraft driven by newly developed jet or rocket engines. Their propulsion systems offered so much extra thrust that designers had to invent revolutionary new wings and other components to harness and cope with the added power. As aircraft became more sophisticated, the role of aircraft designers expanded, and it now included the new discipline of aerodynamics. To assist this advanced breed of scientist, an indispensable new tool was developed, the high-speed wind tunnel. A device for testing new designs at speeds over 1,000 kilometers an hour. The scientists of the Third Reich had at least 10 such wind tunnels at their disposal, while the Western Allies had none. The end product of all this ingenuity was faster aircraft. The Germans were willing to gamble on a myriad of designs should one turn out to be a war winner. Some had wings that were swept back, while others had wings which swept forward, and some even came with adjustable wings. Of all the aircraft produced by this frenzy of innovation, perhaps the strangest sight of all was that of the Heinkel 111Z. It had nothing to do with exotic power plants. In fact, most of the component parts were flying in 1935, when the He-111 medium bomber was paraded as a light passenger plane, a wolf disguised as a lamb. Now, two of these aircraft had been joined together for yet another rule. This type would be known as a Zwilling, German for twins. As novel as Heinkel's Zwilling was, it actually wasn't the first time this approach had been employed. The First World War had brought with it many innovations meant to break the stalemate. Amongst them, there were the tank, the submarine, the airplane, and the now sometimes forgotten military airship. Quite early in the Great War, German Zeppelin airships would slip across the North Sea to the east of England. At first they bombed coastal towns only. However, it wasn't long before they ventured overland to attack London. Damage done to the English capital was not that great. However, the effect on morale was devastating. Not since 1066 had Britain's borders been breached, and now the nation's capital was also under attack. Britain's Army, Air Corps, and Navy were both charged with defending the nation against aerial attack. But the question was, how? Their main problem was that German airships were capable of flying at heights beyond the capabilities of most aircraft. The lightly powered single-engine British fighters of the time would have a hard enough time reaching, never mind downing, a Zeppelin. Realizing the need for a more powerful and robust aircraft, the Royal Navy engaged the Blackburn Airplane Company to develop a dedicated Zeppelin hunter. Blackburn's response was to be a twin-engine seaplane with a two-man crew and two completely separate fuselages. This anti-Zeppelin project was known as the Blackburn Twin Blackburn, or Blackburn TB.
People go to twin fuselages for particular reasons. Normally, it involves some structural strength. How do you get sufficient rigidity into a certain mass so that you can carry the load that you want to? And also, there's other factors that come in, stability on the water, for example, as well as stability in the air.
The Zwilling approach was likely due to the need to carry 4 hours of fuel, which meant a fairly large aircraft. This could be more rapidly achieved by joining two smaller frames, affording easier handling in production and service. However, the Blackburn TB was not a success, and only 9 saw service. The Royal Navy's later fighter flying boats fared much better against the Zeppelin scourge. All told, there were 50 airship raids on England, which cost about 500 British lives and £1.5 million of damage to property. The Germans, too, paid heavily for their raids. Zeppelin construction required an enormous investment, and as countermeasures improved, more and more airships were downed in a ball of flames. After the war, the Zwilling concept was championed by a fascist Italy looking to take its place on the world stage. The rise of fascism started not as one might expect in Germany, but rather in Italy. From 1922 onwards, the fascists progressively gained control of the country. To symbolize Italy's technical progress in aviation, and to show the nation's flag as far afield as possible, fleets of twin-engine flying boats were built with twin hulls, much like a catamaran. The Savoia Marchetti S-55 was an outstanding flying boat, both in its performance and aesthetics.
If you take the Savoia Marchetti S-55 and look at its performance figures and compare it with an airplane that is much prettier, much more beautiful, much more streamlined, and 5 years newer, the Sikorsky S-42, they're very, very close. So there had to be something within the airflow of the Savoia Marchetti S-55 that made it fly better than anybody should reasonably have expected it. And the fact that it flew so successfully and so long on such hazardous flights, on flights that it really had no business engaging in except for the ego of the Italian fascists, is a tribute to it.
Essentially, the S-55 was a maritime patrol bomber, but it served just as well as a transport. There were approximately 240 S-55s produced by several Italian companies, and a number were exported to the Soviet Union, Brazil, Spain, and Romania. Perhaps the most famous name associated with the S-55 is General Italo Balbo, the man who was the heir apparent to Mussolini's dictatorship. Balbo was an interesting character. Despite his position in the party, he was against the pact with Germany and the persecution of the Jews. General Balbo organized and commanded a long-distance goodwill flight with no less than 24 S-55s. The trip from Italy to the Chicago Century of Progress exhibition of 1933 took 48 hours, with aircraft flying in formation for the entire journey. In World War II, as the tides of war began to change, German designers stretched their imaginations to develop innovative aircraft. Might Germany's fate have rested on the success of a Zwilling? In 1941, the German Air Ministry, also known as the RLM, found itself in a crisis situation. The mainstay of their single-engine fighter force was the venerable Messerschmitt Bf-109, a legend of an airplane, although it had an Achilles heel: lack of range. The 109's stablemate was the twin-engine Bf-110. Though built as a bomber escort and with adequate range, it lacked maneuverability and was totally unfit for purpose. An all-new Me-210 escort was hurriedly designed and hundreds of sets of component parts ordered prior to any serious testing. The result was one of the worst manufacturing blunders of the war. The 210 was extremely unstable and dangerous to fly. The RLM spent no less than 18 months trying to remedy the situation with major modifications. As it happened, just before the 210 debacle erupted, the RLM had sent an industry directive to rationalize production and to make more use of existing parts. Messerschmitt had no problems with its single-engine Bf-109, save for range. In fact, it had become an iconic aircraft. Though light and speedy, it was still strong enough for towing small gliders to great heights. A few were even converted to carry fully equipped parachutists on each wing for clandestine missions, a feat that few contemporary fighters would ever attempt. The 109's success was due in part to its lightweight airframe, where load-bearing parts were combined into just one strong firewall. This saved much weight and sped up production exponentially. In light of the RLM directive and the lost 210 deliveries, thoughts turned to a Zwilling concept using existing 109 parts for its foundation.
You have to remember the strain that the German Air Force was under, and that they were being presented with demands from the front for marginal improvements in airspeed and in range and the carrying capability. They would have a specific requirement to go a little bit faster. To achieve this, what are their options? They can go into a clean sheet on the drawing board and they're 6 years downstream and then they know they don't have anything. Or they can look at what they have and say, how can we optimize this particular airplane, the 109? And in the case of the 109, you could double its horsepower by adding another fuselage and another engine to it.
Certainly, 109 frames were quick and economical to construct. Few types could be more so, and they were proven and easily serviced. As well, the new G version would soon be available. Most importantly, a Zwilling 109 could be built without creating an entire new production line. Even with all these positives, there was one nagging concern with this novel idea for a modern twin fighter plane. How might a pilot respond to flying offset to the center line? To research this issue, 2 Clem light aircraft were coupled and tested. Fortunately for the project, there were no adverse effects. A short time later, additional experiments were conducted with the Blom-Voss BV-141, and once again, pilots were able to operate the aircraft without problems. In 1942, the RLM authorized development of 2 Zwilling prototypes built from 90% of the parts already found in a Bf-109G. The remaining 10% of unique components included the center joining wing spar and a similar arrangement in the tailplane. The landing gear for each airframe also had to be repositioned. As there was one pilot only, there was space in the starboard fuselage for a large extra fuel tank, something conventional Bf-109 pilots would have longed for. Of course, it could be said that every 109Z that rolled off the assembly line sacrificed almost 2 standard 109s. So, was it a worthwhile trade-off for the Luftwaffe? They would have gained an aircraft slightly faster than a standard 109, with excellent lifting capability and great range. The best feature of the 109Z was that it would have been available. The Luftwaffe could have had a new escort with very little effort. A prototype was completed in early 1943. Unfortunately, it was hit in an Allied air attack on the Messerschmitt Test Center, and the damage was deemed too severe for repair. Development was abandoned altogether in 1944. By then, production of the Me-262 jet fighter had taken priority over everything.
As early as 1943, German fighter commander Adolf Galland had argued that Germany's aircraft industry should stop building all aircraft except the Focke-Wulf 190 and the Messerschmitt 262, because those were the fighters that could defeat the Allied bombing campaign and thereby perhaps delay or prevent an Allied invasion of Europe. The Zwilling project has interesting practical considerations. But was it really necessary in the overall scheme of the way the war was going for Germany? I don't think so.
Though the Luftwaffe's Zwilling fighter had a premature demise, they had a Zwilling bomber in active service, ready for an invasion. This is the behemoth Me-321 Gigant glider, the largest transport of the Second World War. At one time, aircraft like this were considered as a good way of getting German boots on British soil. However, the invasion of England was abandoned before the Gigant was actually ordered, and its primary purpose was to assist in Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Around 200 Gigants were built. However, the problem of towing the aircraft was never fully resolved. There were three options considered. First on the list was the four-engine Junker Ju-90. This aircraft simply did not have the power to pull a fully loaded Gigant into the air. Another option was the Troika Schlepp. This frightening combination of three Me-110s acting as tow planes provided more power with 6 engines turning, but at a considerable risk to the lives of all involved.
If you can imagine 3 young guys sweating on the cockpit at the end of the runway, all attached to this huge airplane piloted by some guy who probably had 100 hours in the airplane, you know. I mean, what a lurking catastrophe that was.
Desperate for a better third solution, it's said that Reichsmarshal Göring asked Ernst Udet if there might be some merit in joining 2 Heinkel 111s in some way. Udet took this idea to Heinkel, and thus the 111Z was born. Heinkel's offering differed from Messerschmitt's 109 Zwilling in that the elevators to the rear were not joined. This was to provide a clear passage for the tow cable. In addition, the central wing and spar supported 3 engines. These engines, combined with the 2 on the outer wings, gave the 111Z 5 power plants in total, but it was still not enough to lift a fully loaded Gigant without considerable rocket assist. It was at least a safer solution than the dreaded Troika Schlepp. As hard as it might be to believe, Heinkel's Zwilling towplane was in fact greatly respected by all its crews. There were at least 10 examples delivered, and all the pilots agreed that the type flew relatively well. The Luftwaffe commissioned 200 Gigants, believing that the aircraft was suitable for bringing men and machines to the front lines. However, the Gigant was really a giant sitting duck for enemy fire.
The difficulty, of course, that the Germans encountered with all these projects was that none of them were conducted within an umbrella of air superiority. Now, had the Germans had the kind of air superiority that they'd had on the Western Front in 1940, they could have used the Gigants and the 111s to invade England, and it would have been an easy thing. Unfortunately for them, that was not the case, and I often think of the young German kids crowded into that airplane, maybe 150 of them, 200 of them jammed in there, taken off from Sicily or someplace across the Mediterranean and looking up and seeing a cloud of P-40s over them.
Although its Gigant mission may have been ill-conceived, the 111Z at least showed some promise as an aircraft. The pilot sat in the port-side cabin, from where he had complete control of the aircraft. Opposite him in the starboard section was a navigator, who had a duplicate set of flying controls, save for ones to operate the engines. Altogether, there were 7 crew members spread throughout the aircraft, including gunners, mechanics, and a radio operator. Reflecting the RLM's general enthusiasm about the 111Z beyond the towplane, known as the Z1, 2 other versions were also planned. The Z2 was to be a long-range bomber, and the Z3 a long-range reconnaissance aircraft. However, by mid-1944, the Fuhrer had ordered an end to all bomber production, including the entire HE-111 project, along with all its Zwillings. The RLM's interest in converting a 111Z to a long-range high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft probably began in 1943, when, after much development, it became clear that the Heinkel 130 was a failure. Although the Luftwaffe had the advanced Dorado 234 jet observation plane in development, this was for shorter-range work and not the critical long-range strategic missions that the Heinkel 130 was expected to have undertaken. Now, with the entire Heinkel 111 project abandoned, the RLM had to look somewhere else for a solution. As it happened, about this time, the Dornier company was finally being recognized for its exceptional DO-335 Arrow heavy fighter. The 335 was a large and extremely powerful fighter, with two engines, one in the front and the other in the rear. In the past, the 335 push-pull concept had fallen in and out of favor with the RLM. But now, the idea seemed enticing, as Dornier had mastered the centerline thrust principle. Might this unusual configuration, in combination with the Zwilling concept, also lend itself to a long-range, high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft? All the parts were on hand, and at least 30 basic 335s had already come off the production line. The planned reconnaissance HE-111Zs would not have come close to matching a 335 Zwilling in total performance. Extrapolating on the stats of a basic 335, it was expected a Zwilling version would have a maximum speed of 400 miles an hour, with a maximum range of 4,000 miles. This incredible range could be extended farther if flying on just two engines. Still, Dornier had no experience with Zwilling types. Few companies did. Heinkel was asked to participate in the project given the company's experience with the HE-111Z. The success of the Dornier Zwilling was so paramount to the RLM that soon they appointed Dr. Heinrich Hertel of Junkers to take over the entire enterprise. Hertel was a man with enormous credibility within German aviation, having worked on many of the industry's most ambitious projects. As time was of the essence, Hertel made minimum revisions to speed up the first deliveries due in February of 1945. However, it was too little too late. For all intents and purposes, the Second World War was over in Europe. A fierce battle was still raging in the Pacific. Here, America would build its own twins to bring the fight to Japan's doorstep. The war against Japan was, at least in the main, long-range, and serious bombardment of the Japanese homeland could be best achieved by the U.S. Army Air Force's B-29s. Flying from the relatively safe bases in Tinian and Saipan, superfortresses had the range and the altitude to make the long haul to and from the Empire, although not without serious risk of interception by Imperial fighters. Despite having the most advanced defensive fire system of the war, B-29s were still being downed both to and from their targets. In Europe, the P-51D Mustang had reigned supreme as the best escort fighter. However, the Pacific spans were much longer than even the Mustang could deal with. One option was Operation Seahorse, where navalized Mustangs would fly off carriers closer to Japan. In November of 1944, a few P-51s fitted with deck arresters began test flights off the carrier Shangri-La. Another alternative was the P-82 two-seat long-range twin Mustang. In 1943, anticipating the challenge of the Pacific's distances for fighter aircraft, North American Aviation's design chief, Edgar Schmude, was asked to reconfigure his original P-51 into a Zwilling concept escort fighter. Schmude first extended each airframe 4.5 feet, which provided much more space for the critical extra fuel tanks. Next, the landing gear was completely reworked to accommodate the twin Mustang's wider gate. To reduce pilot fatigue over the great distances involved, a complete set of controls was provided for each of the two cockpits, together with tilting seats. With these changes, the twin Mustang would now be able to provide better protection for B-29s all the way to Japan and back. Unfortunately, the conversion wasn't as simple as hoped. Schmude had problems with weight distribution and handling, which could only be fixed by manufacturing new parts. In any event, Neither Operation Seahorse nor the P-82 were required. Standard P-51s were finally able to ride shotgun for the B-29s when the U.S. Marines captured the island of Iwo Jima, much nearer to Japan. In fact, no P-82 saw service in the Second World War. However, the Cold War gave the twin Mustang, known as the F-82, a second lease on life.
The F-82 twin Mustang was in pretty widespread service. It was an escort fighter for the Strategic Air Command. It was a night fighter for Far East Air Forces stationed in Japan, where it replaced the F-61 Black Widow. It was an F-82 piloted by Lieutenant William Hudson, known as Skeeter, that got the first air-to-air victory in the Korean War by shooting down a North Korean propeller-driven aircraft.
In the Korean conflict, the F-82 initially had a leg up on early American jets.
The Americans had introduced jets in the form of the Lockheed P-80s, which were excellent airplanes, but very short range. And the fields of South Korea were such that they could not operate safely from there. So as desirable as the speed and firepower and everything of the jets was, they simply were not useful at the time. So the F-82 was there to take up the slack.
About 270 twin Mustangs were produced, and despite problems, it has to be said it was available and performed well. So did the Zwilling concept really make sense? The answer is sometimes. Blackburn's twin never actually achieved its mission. Still, that was a tall order anyway, and very few other aircraft did any better. Certainly, the Italian SM-55 with 200-plus examples worked very well and proved extremely reliable during years of service. Courtesy of the RAF, we will never know how well the ME-109Z would have performed. However, given the incredible efficiency of the basic 109's production line, which would have provided most of the parts, it seems a reasonable risk for the RLM to have taken. Heinkel's makeshift glider tow may have looked ungainly, but it served its purpose. Juncker's adopted push-pull Zwilling was never finally completed, although the involvement of Dr. Heinrich Hertel, together with the fact that most of the component parts were already available, were ingredients for successful aircraft. Lastly, the P-82 twin Mustang proved a useful night fighter in the early Cold War period. Today, Zwillings are still a rare sight in the skies. However, they are considered and occasionally adopted for very specific purposes.
It's interesting to note that even today that the Zwilling still goes on. And we looked at Bert Rutan, certainly one of the greatest aero engineers of all time, and his great airplanes, which are lifting people in just a few years into commercial space. If you look at the airplane without its vehicle that it's carrying, it's clearly a twin fuselage airplane. It's just a beautiful, beautiful modern Zwilling.
We were frankly shocked to find how far ahead of us they were. Wind tunnels to start with. In the whole of the Allied aviation world, there wasn't a single supersonic wind tunnel. And this is where we were lucky, the country had been divided into occupation zones. This was done before this capitulation. And we had a zone rich in research centres. The main aviation research centres were in the British zone. And the one at Fulkenrode had 3 supersonic wind tunnels. And it was quite astonishing. But later on, when I say supersonic, they were just supersonic, about 1.1, 1.2 Mach number. And but down in Bavaria, we were alerted that there was a wind tunnel there, which had been originally in Peenemünde for Werner von Braun. He had had it built. And when we looked at it, it had been removed from Peenemünde because of the bombing there. And this had an airstream of Mach 4.4. quite incredible. And also the airstream was heated in order to give true supersonic results. So this had been started to being built in 1939. So there was just streets ahead of us in this area. And if I think things had gone on unabated a bit further, I do think Germany would have been the first to have broken the sound barrier, because they had a project which was at the DFS, which was the gliding school. It wasn't a glider, but they did a lot of work on streamlined bodies, and it was being built by Arado, the manufacturer, and it was so far advanced that the Russians realized that they must have been very near ready to go supersonic. They took 50 of the Arado scientists working on it, plus the pilot, lock, stock and barrel, and the airplane back to Russia, and kept them for years. And we believe there is a possibility that the aircraft did go supersonic, but the Russians would never admit it because, of course, it was flown by a German pilot. Now that's a bit of guesswork, but based on some pretty good information. The Me-262, without any question, was the most formidable aircraft of World War II. For this reason, it had a lot of innovatory features and a quantum jump in performance. The innovatory features were, of course, primarily swept-back wings. Secondly, axial flow jet engine. Thirdly, very heavy firepower, 4 30mm cannon. Strangely enough, it had no ejection seat fitted, although the Germans were well advanced in ejection seat technology, but they didn't have an ejection seat fitted. But it was the performance that rattled us, because at this time, the end of the war, the top Allied fighter was the Spitfire Mark 14, with a top speed of 446 miles an hour. When I tested the Me-262 at Farnborough, it had a top speed of 568 miles an hour, 125 miles an hour faster than our fastest fighter. With this sort of fighter, you could conduct combat totally on your terms. If you didn't want to engage, you could go off and leave everybody standing. If you did want to engage, you didn't dogfight with a fighter like this. You made slashing runs at them, blasted at them with your 4 30mm cannon, and then got out of it. Of course, it was not meant mainly for fighter to fighter. It was fighter to bomber. And it had slight disadvantage here because, like us with our first jet, we'd forgotten one thing. That was how to slow them down. And we'd forgotten to fit dive brakes, and so had the Germans. So let's imagine this fighter taking on a B-17 Flying Fortress. It would come in at very high speed. Now, the 30mm cannon had an effective range of 650 yards, but it was inaccurate beyond that range. So you would close to 600 yards, open fire, but your closing speed was so high because you didn't have any air brakes that you had to break off at 200 yards in case you collided with the target. So you had a total firing time of 2 seconds. Now, in that time, you can only point your airplane at the target and shoot at random. If you had dive brakes, you could increase that time from 2 seconds to 4 seconds. And in 4 seconds, you can sight and fire. It would have made quite a bit of difference, maybe not a huge amount. And of course, later on, they introduced, fortunately, at the very end of the war, a fearsome weapon called the R4M air-to-air rocket. And this was fitted in racks of 12 under each wing. And I've seen a picture of it fired against a Marauder medium bomber. And when those rockets hit, 1 minute you have a bomber there, next minute you have confetti. It is just total annihilation. It really was fearsome. Now, the Arado 234, different propositions, straight wing, same engines, but a reconnaissance bomber. But it was so fast, even with straight wings, that it could outrun any Allied fighter. And we know that it had taken, because we found the pictures, taken reconnaissance pictures over Great Britain, operating out of Norway. And it was that fast, as I say, it could fly in with impunity and take the pictures and get out again. Was beautifully streamlined and just a fine bit of wonderful construction. It was easier to keep serviceable than the Messerschmitt 262. And we flew the 262 a lot, but I tended to fly the Arado more because we were getting more information on the engine out of it. That's what we really wanted at that stage. The 163, in my opinion, at the end of the day, was a tool of desperation. It was not, I don't think, operationally effective. Its operational record is this. In its entire operational time, it killed 16 Allied aircraft for the loss of 10 of its own. But the other side of the coin was they lost over 40 with operational accidents due to the high volatility of the fuels used, which were extremely dangerous. It had, again, innovation was the name of the game here. You had swept wings on this. It was semi-tailless. It had a vertical tail, but no horizontal tail. It had elevons for both longitudinal and lateral control. It had a rocket motor, which was unique in this sense. Rockets have been tried in aircraft for years, both solid fuel and liquid fuel, but all had the same problem. When you lit the touch paper, you sit back and there's nothing you can do about it till it burns itself out. Here was a rocket produced which was throttleable. It could be throttled to either idle, cruise, or full power. It also had a skid landing, but the main problem with it was the fuels were incredibly volatile. Its main fuel was concentrated hydrogen peroxide. Now, I know nothing more explosive, with perhaps the exception of nitroglycerin, than concentrated hydrogen peroxide. And you had, under full power, 120 seconds of flight. That was all. Every landing was a dead stick landing. but you had to absolutely ensure that no fuel was left in the system. You had a jettison system on the aircraft, but sometimes it didn't work. If you landed with as much as a cupful of fuel in the aircraft, the impact of touchdown would cause a violent explosion that would destroy both the aircraft and the crew, the pilot, of course. So this was the danger. Another side of it was danger to the pilot in combat. When I flew the 163, I found that it had quite a comfortable pilot seat, and it had arms rather like these are rounded. I thought this is very comfortable, but then I realized both these arms were hydrogen peroxide fuel tanks. And I said to the designer of the rocket, that is, Dr. Walter, I was in no danger of combat damage because I was flying it after the war was over, but what would happen if a bullet went through one of these tanks? And he said, well, we have done tests. And he said, even if you are using a non-organic suit, that if a bullet goes through and fuel leaks, it would take 9 minutes to melt the pilot. So that's the sort of horror side of that. And you can see where the accidents obviously occurred. Well, he was picked up by the Americans, so he wasn't in our care at all. But we, in the American occupation zone, they had a team doing precisely what we were doing in the Fallon mission. And in the whole of the American occupation zone, they hadn't a single Arado 234. And they were very keen to get one. So our government said they could have 2 from the lot at Norway, because we had almost a wing of them up there. So they were given 2. Then they came back to us and said, the Secretary of State said, we would very much like to have another 2. And I hummed and hawed over this purely as a game and said to them, well, we might be able to arrange it, but we would like a quid pro quo. And they said, well, what are you after? And I said, interrogation rights with Goering. So they started a hum and haw. Anyway, about a month went past, and eventually they came up and said, okay, it's a deal. And we gave them 2 more, and I got access to Goering for an hour. And would you like to hear about it? He was in a hotel near Luxembourg, under American captivity. And he was really being held there prior to the Nuremberg trials, which were approaching quite fast. Because I interrogated him, I think, if I recollect, it was the 16th of June, 1945. And I was given an hour, told I mustn't ask him any political questions because of the Nuremberg trials coming up, but I could ask him only aviation questions. Well, when he was brought in to the interrogation room, his clothes were hanging on him because the Americans had weaned him off drugs, and he'd lost a lot of weight. And he was looking po-faced, frankly, because I think he'd been interrogated up to here. And then the American invigilating officer, who had to be present during these interrogations, said to him, you're going to be interrogated for the first time by a pilot. And his attitude changed completely. He smiled, and He didn't offer to shake hands. Well, I wouldn't have shaken hands with him anyway. But he was very affable. And frankly, I found him a charismatic rogue, frankly. He was highly intelligent, there's no doubt about that, as he demonstrated at the Nuremberg trials. But anything I asked him, he would deliberate for a little while before answering, but answer direct, no shilly-shallying around. And maybe the key question that would interest people was I asked him what he thought the outcome of the Battle of Britain was, to which he replied that it was a draw. And I said, well, how did you arrive at that conclusion? And he said, well, if you look at the official casualty lists on both sides, he said, there isn't much between them. Now, that's not an unreasonable statement when you look at the casualty lists. And he said, secondly, we withdrew. We were not defeated, we withdrew because Hitler ordered all the air units back to train for Operation Barbarossa, which was the invasion of Russia. Now, that is also factually true. Now, I would not like to tell the RAF that he had reached a conclusion which was not unreasonable, because clearly, as far as we were concerned, victory was 100% on our side. But his reasoning was not too bad if you consider it all.
Willy Messerschmitt's fabled Bf-109 was manufactured in greater numbers than any other production aircraft. Almost 34,000 were built. Usually referred to as the Me-109, at the time the aircraft was conceived, it was designated the Bf-109. B because the maker was located in Bavaria, and F because the company was called Flugwerk. It was only when Willy Messerschmitt gained full control of the company that the Me prefix was assigned. Throughout the 30s and during the Second World War, Willy Messerschmitt endured a dogged relationship with Erhard Milch, who had gained high position with the fledgling state airline Lufthansa and later with the German Air Ministry, more often known as the RLM. A close friend of Milch was killed piloting a Messerschmitt-designed transport plane, the M-20, on its first flight. Milch was to blame Messerschmitt over the accident, a grudge that was to last for years. Fortunately, Messerschmitt had cultivated a relationship with Hermann Göring, who ultimately became Milch's superior. To get his first Luftwaffe fighter contract, Messerschmitt's Bf-109 had to compete with an advanced Heinkel design, the He-112.
There's no question the Heinkel aircraft was the better-looking aircraft. But, and incidentally, when it came to the test pilots at Rechlin, they gave the 112 the better report, considerably better over the 109. But Udet decided that he was under pressure to produce numbers of aircraft rather than quality. And he realized, quite rightly, that the 109 was far easier to produce in numbers than the 112, basically because the undercarriage on the 109 was an integral part of the fuselage. So the fuselage and the wings could be produced separately and then joined at a later date.
In the end, the competition was won by the 109, and a legend was born. The 109 first saw service in Spain. Along with other modern German aircraft like the Stuka, the 109 was tested in actual combat conditions. The lessons gained would later be applied to a much larger conflict in the skies over Britain. In Spain, it became clear that the 109 lacked range and endurance. Its slender lines made for greater speed, but left little space for fuel. One possible solution to this problem was to use the Bf-110 to tow the smaller 109 to the combat area, thus preserving its limited fuel for fighting. Novel though the idea was, the towing technique proved impractical for all but glider warfare. However, a few years later, when Germany was suffering from the relentless heavy bombing of the US 8th Air Force, the 109 was employed as a test aircraft in towing a unique glider fighter concept offered by the Blum and Voss company. The BV-40 was a very low-cost fighter glider that would have been coupled to a Bf-109. When the tiny Blum and Voss design was in a position above the American bombers, it was released to attack them, using its two 30mm cannons and their limited stock of ammunition. The BV-40 was so small its pilot had to lie on a mattress in a prone position. However, the BV-40 relied upon its diminutive size to avoid US gunners. Only 7 BV-40s were built before the project was abandoned, probably because the Me-163 was a slightly more practical and self-contained concept. 109s were also pressed into service for clandestine missions, dropping spies and saboteurs behind enemy lines. Special capsules could be attached to both wings, each containing a single parachutist. An often overlooked feature of the 109 was its system of leading-edge slats on the forward surface of the wings. These made for better handling and shorter takeoffs. Interestingly, the concept had been developed and patented by the British Hanley Page Company, and Messerschmitt had to pay for the use of the invention. The slats proved so successful that they were also used in Messerschmitt's 410 and legendary 262 jet fighter. The 262 had another link to the Bf-109, owing to the fact that the jet's nose wheel assembly is actually a single main wheel strut from the Bf-109's narrow gate undercarriage. The 109's narrow gate undercarriage was always a challenge when it came to landing or takeoff, even under normal conditions. At one point in the war, the Kriegsmarine had high hopes for its sole aircraft carrier, the Zeppelin. It was always assumed that the Zeppelin would be equipped with Stukas and 109s. The Stuka's wide-gate undercarriage would have been suitable for aircraft carrier landings, but the standard 109 arrangement was not. Accordingly, Messerschmitt set to work to modify the wings so that the wheels could function in a more stable wide-gate fashion. This aircraft was designated the Me-155. The Zeppelin never put to sea, and the 155 was abandoned, only to be later resurrected by the Blum and Voss company as a very high-altitude fighter concept. But this came too late to help an ailing Germany. Messerschmitt followed the 109 with the Bf-110. Although this later became successful in several other roles, it was never suitable for the long-range bomber escort mission. Messerschmitt quickly offered the 210 as an alternative, but this proved to be a failure, and so the Me-410 was rushed into development. As a precaution, in 1942, the company was ordered to develop a backup aircraft based on existing 109 parts and using 2 fuselages, which enabled the creation of a totally new aircraft employing a minimum number of new parts. The Me-109Z Zwilling was made as a single-seat, very long-range, heavy fighter. It might have shown great promise if the 2 prototypes had not been badly damaged in an Allied bombing raid. This loss demonstrated that Germany needed a homeland defender more than a bomber escort at this stage of the war. In addition, the Me-262 jet was close to delivery, and this groundbreaking design could have been a real game-changer if they had arrived in time. Possible proof of the Me-109Z's viability came with the US North American P-82 twin Mustang. Independently, the German designer of the P-82 chose to follow exactly the same approach as the Me-109Z. 270 twin Mustangs were actually produced and served in Korea and the United States as night fighters. In another pairing, Bf-109s were flown with other aircraft during the Mistral missions. These occurred when Germany's fortunes were declining and the Wehrmacht were looking to develop a new type of flying bomb. The concept would use a disposable unmanned bomber filled with explosives, but guided by a piloted 109. Gliders were first used to prove this concept, but eventually two-engine bombers were employed. The Bf-109 was produced in greater numbers than any aircraft in history. It served the Luftwaffe and other air forces well, and it proved more than an adequate fighter for Germany until it was supplanted by the FW-190. Even then, it remained in active service and production until the end of the war. The Bf-109 was one of aviation's great planes.
The Stuka, a name that brought dread and fear to hundreds of thousands as it ushered in the Second World War. With sirens shrieking, it dived to deliver death and destruction, quickly becoming a potent symbol of blitzkrieg. Although an effective weapon of terror, the Stuka had serious design flaws. The Ju-87 Stuka had its origins in an earlier design by the Junkers Company. The model K-47 was built in 1927 as a civilian aircraft at a time when Germany was prohibited from making military planes. Later, it was converted to a rugged two-seat fighter with a rear gunner able to fire between its twin rudders. Over time, the K-47 developed into a prototype dive bomber. From these tests, the concept for the Stuka was to emerge. However, the Stuka was not Germany's first dive bomber. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, they quickly rearmed the Luftwaffe by transforming the Heinkel 50 and the Henschel 123 into dive bombers. The modifications to the 123 proved to be much more than just a short-term fix. This formidable biplane provided effective close support and dive bombing service across Europe until 1944. The very first Stuka produced was made in secret at the Junkers factory in Sweden. But the Stuka's introduction to service was held up by problems in development. Hermann Pohlmann, Stuka's designer, had also worked on the K-47, and he chose to adopt much of the earlier aircraft's layout, including its twin-rudder tailplane. But the Ju-87's weight and diving requirements were much greater than the K-47. On the 24th of January 1936, the prototype Stuka crashed in a dive when the entire tailplane simply broke off. The crash killed the test pilot and his engineer. The accident left Pohlmann with little choice but to modify the tail. Accurate bombing required diving vertically. The twin fins and rudders were simply too weak to withstand the strong forces during a dive. Pohlmann's solution was to change to a stronger single rudder. But this created another problem. The vertical stabilizer greatly reduced the rear gunner's field of fire. The Junkers 87 double fin layout had failed, and the tail had already gone through one major transition, which in many ways was a step backwards, at least as far as the plane's defense was concerned. Other ideas like a rudder that could slide clear in flight were tested. This at least would have left the rear gunner with an unrestricted field of fire. The final solution came when an innovative rotating rudder was developed. However, this also meant major modifications to the fuselage. The Stuka's shortcomings forced Junkers to go back to the drawing board. This time they proposed a totally new Super Stuka with an advanced fire control system using an optical gun sight and cannons that would keep any fighter at bay. However, all this innovation would require a complete retooling of the factory and disruption of the existing production line.
Well, my feeling is that there were too many innovations involved in this aircraft, and not very effective ones. In fact, one might say there were minuses rather than pluses. To give the rear gunner a better field of fire by dropping the tail was a very small plus, because there really was an ineffective defensive situation anyway in the Stuka. Very small caliber guns with one gunner in the back. To retract the undercarriage was to remove one of the main drag factors in the dive with this aircraft. And this was a very important factor, the fact that the undercarriage did give such drag, because that did stop acceleration in the dive, and that gives you more time for aiming, better accuracy, and altogether you were removing one of the pluses and putting a minus in its place. These things have their pros and their cons, because the Stuka really, even with an open field of fire, was not very defensible. So it's a matter of weighing up pros and cons, and in this case I believe the cons outweighed the pros, frankly.
There were other considerations too. By the end of 1941, the Luftwaffe had a much stronger day fighter than the Bf 109. The new fighter was the Focke-Wulf 190. The 190 was also strong enough to accurately deliver a bomb, at least in a moderate dive. Since the new fighter now shared dive bombing duties, the Stuka had to soldier on in its original form. However, it was also given a new role where it was to excel. After Germany's abortive attack against Russia, the Eastern Front became very much a tank war.
With the Heinkel 129, the Luftwaffe did have a specialist anti-tank plane, but there were never enough of them. The HS-129 was heavily armored to provide good pilot protection, but the aircraft was underpowered, a factor that endangered its entire mission. So Stuka's support for the anti-tank role was timely.
So the Junkers Ju-87 was pressed into service and became a very effective tank buster. Other jobs included transport missions where the venerable Stuka performed the duty of a communications vehicle, taking staff and supplies to the front line. On the return trip, it was often used to ferry wounded soldiers in a gondola set on top of each wing. In the bitter cold of a winter on the Russian front, these converted dive bombers must have been a welcome sight, although their story is little known. Equally unknown is the role that Stukas would have played had Hitler's only aircraft carrier, the Zeppelin, ever put to sea. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots had warned that if Stukas were attacked and forced to ditch in the sea, there would be serious problems. As their fixed undercarriage hit the water, the plane was likely to cartwheel. Junkers' solution was to use explosive bolts to jettison the landing gear, permitting a much safer ditching on water. The Stuka didn't just stay in service until the war ended, it also stayed in production. Over 6,500 were built before the last one was pushed off the production line, probably cobbled together from damaged or spare parts. Despite the large numbers produced, only a handful of Ju-87s have been found. But the terror they created still remains seared in the minds of survivors.
When he's diving straight at you, you see the pilot, and you are pretty sure that therefore he can see you as well, you see. And you think, oh my God, he finished me off. When he was diving at you, you had a feeling he's bound to get you. you know, and even in the First World War, people, shall we say, fighter pilots used to attack and fire machine guns at people and so on. This you can hide. You can hide behind a wall, you can hide behind a ditch, you can hide behind a tree. You can't hide from a bomb, because bomb will destroy the wall. And it's really and truly frightening.
During the early stages of the Cold War, and before the advent of guided missiles,
The West had to rely heavily upon jet-powered fighters to ward off Soviet bombers. For some time, the only effective armament for these fighters were barrages of unguided missiles.
One of the changes that took place in the 1950s involved air-to-air weapons. It had been traditional until then that combat airplanes would carry machine guns or cannons. And everyone knew and everyone said that fighters need guns, except when they didn't say that. And they didn't say that when they were talking about defending the United States against bomber attack. They designed several types of interceptors that used partly or entirely unguided air-to-air rocket projectiles.
At first, each interceptor would just have one opportunity to fire in a gunshot approach with a weapon from a bygone war. The B-29 was more expensive to develop than the atom bomb. It was so complex to build that some manufacturers are said to have taken on other projects just to avoid being selected to assemble this most advanced flying machine. Even Boeing didn't really want the task of building their own creation. In the end, the Army Air Force took over much of the management, although Boeing, Bell and Martin still had to deliver. The B-29 was cloaked in secrecy throughout its early development. Occasionally details were released, but this was really disinformation to confuse the enemy, who by 1944 had seen enough of the superfortress to fear its destructive capability. In one such subterfuge, a single B-29 was landed near London to convince the German High Command that many other B-29s were to follow. The result was that Germany took extensive precautions to counter the superfortress, although none were necessary as the United States never planned to attack Germany with B-29s. The war against the Japanese Empire was a very different matter. Japan was the target that the superfortress was conceived and built to attack. Rushed into service, many early B-29s flew over Japan with technical problems, particularly with engines overheating. One safe haven for a damaged and struggling superfortress was the Soviet port of Vladivostok. At this time, Russia was not a combatant with Japan. In fact, it was technically a neutral power that could not give support to either the United States or Japan. At least 3 B-29s were forced to land in Vladivostok. They were promptly seized, repaired, and flown to Moscow. Just before the Japanese surrendered, Russia declared war on Japan, which made them a US ally in the Pacific. But Russia still refused to return the 3 B-29s. American wisdom was that a superfortress would be technically too sophisticated for Soviet engineers to replicate. And that view prevailed for several years, even as the Soviet relationship deteriorated from ally to enemy. However, in 1947, at Moscow's annual Aviation Day parade, 3 B-29s appeared overhead. At first, Western observers assumed they were American, but opinion quickly changed when a fourth identical aircraft appeared. Soviet engineers had obviously developed a clone. This was bad news on the aviation front, but worse still was the knowledge that the Soviets had for some time breached Western security and had gained access to atomic secrets. The Los Alamos project alone had at least 3 Soviet spies in its workforce. In August 1949, the Soviets, in an exercise known as First Lightning, detonated their first atomic bomb. The news shocked the West. Soviet possession of the atom bomb and the means to deliver it demanded an effective response. However, most Western air forces at the time were still flying fighters from World War II. Anticipating the nuclear threat, in 1946 a new air defense command had been formed for the aerial protection of the continental United States. At first, the ADC had to rely upon a stalwart Second World War night fighter, the Northrop P-61 Black Widow. The aircraft offered some radar capability, long-range and all-weather endurance, but most important of all, it was available. Later, an unusual derivative of the successful P-51 Mustang, the P-82 Twin Mustang, was pressed into service. The original P-82 was envisioned as an escort fighter. It was fitted with radar and served as an ADC interceptor. However, neither of these aircraft had the speed of a jet, and they relied upon machine guns or cannons, neither of which were likely to be very effective against a B-29, wherever it was built. Having designed the superfortress in the first place, the US knew only too well its defensive capability. The task of successfully downing a B-29 had been given to German engineers some years earlier, when the Nazi hierarchy were tricked into believing that superfortresses would be used over Germany. The Wehrmacht's answer came in the form of the A4M rocket. The rocket had been developed from an artillery missile of slightly less than 3 inches diameter and had 8 folding fins. These would be fired in a salvo at an oncoming American bomber. The salvo approach was necessary because the rockets lacked accuracy. Allied intelligence had been aware of the A4M's devastating effect when they hit a target, especially when coupled with the speed of an Me-262. Against this arrangement, the Allies had no answer.
One of the weapons that really, I think, would have been a very frightening thing if it had gone much further was the Me-262 armed with the R4M rocket missiles. Now, they had 2 batteries or 2 racks of 12 in each wing, and they were used right at the end of the war. Not in a great deal, but when they struck a bomber, it wasn't a question of damaging it or downing it, it was a question of disintegrating the entire thing. It was, a hit was total destruction.
The technology was really quite basic. In the 262's case, the launch platforms were basically carved out of wood. Other German interceptors using the A4M were fired from a simple metal tube nicknamed the stovepipe. Apart from the A4M's motor, the only other technology it employed was its folding fins, which snapped open after launch. FW-190s and Me-262s were adapted to use Germany's new rocket defense. However, there was one aircraft that was built around the A4M. Extremely ambitious and reflecting the desperate state of the Third Reich, the Bachem-Natter's sole reason for existence was to deliver the deadly folding fin rocket. The Natter used a chemical-driven Walter rocket as its main motor. 4 solid-fueled rocket power plants aided its vertical takeoff. Bachem's design only flew on one occasion and killed its young pilot in the process. But knowing of its deadly potential, Allied ground groups were to prioritize the capture of anything to do with the A4M. Fast forward to 1949. NATO gives Russia's clone nuclear bomber the codename Bull. By this time, some of America's first-generation Air Defense Command jets were close to delivery. Many of them were developed for use with 2 valuable assets that would help reduce the Soviet threat. Firstly, the US had improved on the A4M concept with the introduction of a 4-finned 2.75-inch rocket that would ultimately be named Mighty Mouse, after the popular cartoon character of the time.
Quite a few of the aircraft projects in the 1950s did away with the gun. It was thought the gun, and in other words close-in fighting, was no longer required. It would be air-to-air missiles. But you can only carry a small number of missiles at the time. And so an alternative to the gun was the unguided rocket. In America, the version was known as the Mighty Mouse.
Airborne radar was also coming of age. First employed at the end of World War II, it was now ready for use in conjunction with ground radar. Radar was particularly important when employing fighters known as interceptors, as they are required to fly at night and in all weather conditions. In 1945, the US Army Air Force was preparing to enter the jet age and had asked for submissions for a jet-powered night fighter to replace the propeller-driven aircraft it then had in service. A serious contender for this contract was the Nighthawk, a 4-engined dual-seat interceptor from the Curtiss-Wright Company. The Nighthawk's failure to perform in flight tests in 1948 led to the demise of the Curtiss-Wright Company. Instead, Air Defense Command chose a contender from Northrop. The F-89 Scorpion had 2 engines for safety and dual seats, one for a dedicated radar operator. The Scorpion was to be equipped with cannons because Mighty Mouse was not yet available. Delays in delivery of the F-89s had the advantage of enabling them all to be fitted with folding fin rockets. In fact, the Scorpion could carry 102 of the rockets.
The F-89, which was quite an interesting aircraft with big rocket pods out on the end of the wing, and pretty heavy aircraft, but the usual case that we've done in so many of our aircraft, by the time we get through hanging things on them, they're all underpowered. and the F-89 didn't last long, but it was one of the airplanes in the air defense development that took place as we moved into the Cold War time frame and our expectations that we might have to fight Russia.
However, late delivery of the F-89s at this very sensitive time in history led Air Defense Command to order 2 other interceptors as immediate backup. Lockheed calculated that they could convert the T-33 trainer to a two-seat interceptor using up to 75% of the Tu-33's parts, a major saving in money, and more importantly, time. ADC was very impressed, as the first flight of the XF-94 was made just 3 months after the contract was signed. The latest C version of the Starfire carried Mighty Mouse rockets, just as they were starting to become available. The second backup for the Scorpion was a North American aviation project. The company's F-86 Sabre had been a major step forward in fighter design, but it was primarily a dogfighter, not an interceptor. But North American believed that the basic frame could be converted into the interceptor role. In the event, only about 25% of the original F-86 parts were used to make the F-86D or Sabre Dog. Nevertheless, their unit cost was around 1/3 of the twin-engine Scorpion. Nearly all the 2,800 F-86Ds that rolled out of North American's plant were armed with the Mighty Mouse rocket. Like the Nazis' Backe-Natter interceptor rocket, it existed solely for the purpose of delivering 2.75-inch folding-fin rockets.
The F-86D didn't have any guns. The F-86D Sabre carried a tray of these rockets under the pilot. The tray had to be extended, then the rockets could be fired.
There was another interceptor that would be armed with the folding fin projectile, the Canadian CF-100.
We had 2 rocket pods, 29 rockets each, and so there's 58 total, and it was a one-shot effort. So when you were into a bomber stream and locked onto the bomber, you would fire these things off, and it was essentially a shotgun type approach. You're bound to hit something. One rocket would do the job.
Of course, it's all.
Canada's Arctic region required an all-weather aircraft. Like the Scorpion and the Starfire, the CF-100 had a 2-seat configuration with a dedicated radar operator in the rear. Working in conjunction with a string of early warning radar posts, almost 700 CF-100s were built. They served for almost 30 years. So important was the project that Avro Canada cancelled its promising early jet airliner design to concentrate on its rocket-firing defender of North America. Eventually, Mighty Mouse rockets were superseded by supersonic surface-to-air missiles like the Boeing Bomark. Army Nike shorter-range anti-aircraft missiles took over much of the air defense role in the mid to late 50s. Air Defense Command did retain the use of some Mighty Mouse rockets on its new generation interceptor, the F-102 Dagger, but only as support for the Falcon-guided missile, which was the Dagger's primary weapon. As guided missile technology improved, the Mighty Mouse was no longer able to compete for a spot on board US interceptors.
The unguided rockets, they didn't have very much range, they were unguided, and of course the moment you fired them they were under the effect of gravity, so actually getting them to actually hit a target, anything beyond a very short distance, was really not much chance. And so needless to say, by the 1960s this weapon wasn't carried very often at all.
During the Vietnam War, the 2.75-inch rocket was paired with armed helicopters, and it was reborn as a ground attack weapon. Literally millions of Mighty Mouse rockets were launched against North Vietnamese targets from a wide range of US rotary and fixed-wing aircraft. Specialized warheads could be fitted onto the rockets depending on their intended end use, be it anti-personnel, anti-tank, or basic target marking. During the Gulf War, the Apache helicopters that opened the air campaign by destroying 2 Iraqi radar sites with Hellfire missiles also carried Hydra 70 rockets, the modern-day incarnation of the Mighty Mouse. The folding fin rocket was born out of the Reich's desperate need to stop the flow of Allied bombers devastating its territory. When faced with the possibility of nuclear annihilation by Soviet bombers, the US grabbed onto this German weapon and adapted it into their own Mighty Mouse. Though surface-to-air missiles and air-to-air missiles would relieve the Mighty Mouse of its intended mission of knocking down Soviet bombers, the folding fin rocket would find new life as a ground attack weapon, a mission it still carries out to this day.
From 1933 until the end of the Second World War, German aviation led the world in aerodynamic design and technical innovation. Long before the outbreak of hostilities, German industry produced an armada of technically superior warplanes. When war broke out, the Luftwaffe quickly overwhelmed some of Europe's most vaunted air forces. Classic designs like the Bf-109 fighter and Ju-88 proved to be superior fighting machines, while others like the Blumenvoss Bv-141 became one of aviation's true oddities. Germany's plan for war in Europe called for an air force that was to be used in direct support of its ground forces. The Luftwaffe's task was to sweep the skies clear of enemy fighters, then destroy enemy troops and installations. Key to the Luftwaffe's success were ground attack aircraft like the Heinkel 123 and Ju-87 dive bomber. Ordered in 1934, the Heinkel 123 proved to be a rugged and reliable aircraft. It would see service well into 1944. Ground attack was only effective when good battlefield observation and reconnaissance could locate enemy targets. That job was given to the Heinkel 126. With its excellent low-speed, short-field characteristics, an outstanding all-round view, the HS-126 proved a great success in the early campaigns of 1939 and 1940. The HS-126 would see action on every front, but by 1941 its limited performance was beginning to show, and a new battlefield reconnaissance aircraft was needed. This led to some of the war's most unusual designs. The Blumenvoss company was one of the first to respond with their BV-141. Designed around the concept of maximum all-round view, the BV-141 was in many ways a problem looking for a solution. The unorthodox design featured an asymmetric layout, with the radial engine installed at the front end of a port-side tail boom, and an extensively glazed crew nacelle mounted to starboard. Unusual and radical in design, the BV-141 performed surprisingly well, but in the end it was considered too unconventional and it was cancelled in 1943.
Yes, in my meanderings throughout Germany, just after the capitulation, I was looking for unusual or advanced technology aircraft. And the 141 intrigued me a little, but I had heard that they were at an airfield called Größenhain, which was quite near Meissen. there was a big reconnaissance unit which had many reconnaissance types of aircraft, and I thought maybe the 141 will appear there. So I flew there, and there was no sign of one, but I asked if I could speak to some of the POWs who were in the cage there, and one of the chaps told me that a 141 had indeed been there, but the last he remembered of it was not too long ago. It had had an engine problem while flying nearby and had landed on an emergency strip east of Grossenheim. So I flew over in that direction looking for this strip. But it wasn't really a strip, I found. It was a small airfield. And it was, by this time I'd moved into the Russian occupation zone. And I decided to land there because I had already found that that stage after the war, the Russians were still very amenable to the Brits because we had come in at the early stages of the war to help them. Anyway, when I landed, there wasn't a lot of aircraft there, and there was a Russian commissar and with an interpreter, and I asked if there was a 141 there. He didn't really know things like the aircraft numbers, but he said there were one or two aircraft left, but his people had examined the airfield, taken away what they wanted, and the rest was left for destruction. So I said, could I have a look around, see what there was? He said, well, yes, why not? Because it's all going to be destroyed anyway. And in one hangar, there was indeed a 141. It had regularly had its engines run up by Feldwebel, who was available. And I said to him, was the aircraft flyable? And he declared, oh, yes, it was. I rather suspected his motive, so I wasn't too sure of what he was saying or believing what he was saying, because I think he had hoped I would fly him out of there and out of the Russian zone. But the Russians were obviously not going to play with that. Anyway, I thought I'll take his word for it and have a go at this. And the commissar didn't object. He said, as long as I stayed within sight of the airfield, and I'd only have enough fuel to do that, he didn't mind, because it was due for destruction anyway. And so he let me fly that, and I had about 30 to 40 minutes in it to try out this theory that it flew very nicely in a straight line when on an angle of bank of 90 degrees. And after about 2 or 3 goes at this at various speeds and heights, I had trouble with the engine. So I had to return to base. And so I formed an impression that it probably did what it said it could do. But its real reason for failing, in my opinion, was it certainly wasn't an aircraft in the same category of handling as the Focke-Wulf 189, which I had already flown, and was its competitor.
Another odd-looking aircraft was the Focke-Wulf 189. The completely glazed central nacelle, twin engines and tail booms were considered too radical for conservative Luftwaffe officials. Performance, however, won the day. Known as the Flying Eye, the FW-189 proved supremely versatile, universally popular, and one of the most reliable aircraft ever to see Luftwaffe service. During combat operations, the FW-189 surpassed all expectations. Despite flying low over the battlefield and taking large amounts of damage, it had the ability to absorb punishment and fight another day.
So I think that killed it more than the theory that it gave the gunner a wonderful field of fire by having no starboard half of the tailplane and being asymmetrically offset to give a clear field of fire to the gunner. So that was my experience of it. Not very impressive, but interesting. The Arado 234 was a beautiful looking airplane. Aesthetically, it was very clean and looked dynamic, aerodynamically, very attractive. And the cockpit was unusual. It was a glass cockpit right at the nose, and it reminded me, when I got into it, rather of like being in a helicopter. You were stuck right out in the front there with completely clear vision around you. On the other hand, you were sitting pretty close to the accident if it had to happen too. And my first meeting with the 234 wasn't a very happy event, because this was up at Grover in Denmark, where we found a number of 234s, and I had one prepared for a flight by the German crew, because we obviously didn't have the expertise to deal with it at that stage. And I taxied it out to the end of the runway. I was well aware, of course, that the Jumo 004 engines so fitted to it had a scrap life, total scrap life of 25 hours. So one really needed to know the service history of the engines you were flying. Now, the Germans were very, very adept at destroying documentation, and we could find no service records. However, I taxied out to the end of the runway at Grover and revved up to full power, ready for takeoff, and then just about to release the brakes when the starboard engine exploded and totally disintegrated, taking most of the starboard wing with it. And this, of course, could mean one of two things. Either the crew had sabotaged it, or it was an engine with 24 hours and 50 minutes on it. We never got to the bottom of what caused it, but suffice it to say that I must have flown something like 300 to 400 hours on the Jumo 004 and various aircraft, and never had another problem with it after that. So it did not give me a poor impression of the 234. On the contrary, when I flew it, it was a very nice aircraft to handle, at a very fast turn of speed. It could fly at and cruise, and its top speed was 474 miles an hour, which was very high. And of course, it relied on this speed for its survival, because it had no guns fitted to it, and was purely a reconnaissance bomber as such. But as I say, handled beautifully. It was straight wing, was not swept wing, and made a very good impression.
The Junkers Ju-52, affectionately known by those who flew her as Iron Annie, or Auntie U, or simply Auntie. The tri-motored transport, which also served as a bomber, was to become a legend, not only for her longevity, but also for her flexibility. She was in fact as much a symbol of the Luftwaffe as the Stuka and the 109.
The Ju-52 was like the DC 2 and 3, I would say an iconic aircraft, because its reliability, its three-engine aircraft, very, very reliable, And one wonders why they weren't more frequently used in the UK and the USA, the three-engine layout, because it was very common in Italy, was used quite widely in Germany, and but you just have rare cases of it in the States, like the Tri-Motor Ford, but it's a great solution.
The Ju-52 was constructed with the same corrugated material that the Junkers company was to rely upon for over 2 decades, going back almost to the Great War. During this period, aircraft much larger than the 52, such as the behemoth Junker G38, also used the same cladding. However, as the 30s came to a close, Junker's corrugated hallmark was starting to look a little tired, especially compared with other foreign types like the American DC-2 and DC-3. Nevertheless, Auntie still stayed in service. The Junkers company had in fact designed a replacement for Auntie prior to the start of World War II. Although they still wanted to retain its tri-motor configuration, it was in most other respects a totally new aircraft.
The Ju-252. It was a distinct difference from the very famous Ju-52. It had smooth stressed wings and a very large cargo fuselage capacity. One of the main features about it was it had a wonderful loading ramp, which was operated hydraulically at the back end of the aeroplane. Now, this was a tail-wheel aeroplane, but after landing, the ramp could be operated and would come down and raise the aircraft's tail. And it was absolutely top-notch. And the incredible thing about it was we actually did experiments to see how this thing would react on the airplane in flight. And at the large enemy aircraft exhibition in October of 1945, we flew this aircraft with the ramp fully open, and as a gimmick, we had a chap sitting on one of the lower steps on the ramp, obviously with a harness attached, but he was sitting there pretending to smoke a cigarette. Well, it appealed very heavily to the crowds, and it was quite surprising that this aircraft had this tremendous range of central gravity and was very trimmable in that situation.
The Ju-252 had a stablemate, the Ju-352, which was made largely of wood to reduce the use of aluminum. The Ju-352 proved less successful, although they were the first transport types to use a tailgate ramp that provided a flat surface for loading. Between the two models, only 65 examples were actually produced. When Germany was attacked on two fronts in 1944, they went out of production, as the priority was more fighters to defend the fatherland. Another military transport which used a rear ramp also came from the drafting boards of Junkers. The Ju-290 evolved from the four-engine Junkers 90 airliner, which showed great promise as an advanced design just before the war. The Ju-90 airliner, like most other aircraft of the time, was a tail dragger. So when Junkers created a transport version, they employed the same lifting tailgate developed for the earlier 252. For the time, the Ju-290 transport was a large aircraft when it first came into service in August of 1942.
When I flew the Ju-290, I was very impressed with it in the sense that it had a lovely cockpit layout, a very comfortable layout. It was obviously a civil aircraft adapted to a military role, rather like the Focke-Wulf 200. It was almost similarly armed, not quite so heavily armed as the Focke-Wulf 200, but flew very nicely. And I think it would have made a comfortable, with a little adaptation, a comfortable transatlantic piston engine aircraft in the early days. In fact, after the war, of course, the Americans, they had a group like I had retrieving aircraft, German aircraft after the war. They were called Watson's Whizzers. And Colonel Watson actually flew the Ju-290 back to America via Bermuda. And he was very impressed with it, as indeed I was too.
It was certainly the largest land-based powered aircraft in the Luftwaffe inventory. The type was 8 foot longer than the airliner version, had more powerful engines, and a very considerable range. It had been claimed, although never proven, that it made direct flights between Germany and Japan. There was also a need for smaller transports, even smaller than Anti-U. This need was filled by the conversion of a medium-sized glider into a powered aircraft. The Gotha 244 became available in 1943, created by the simple addition of 2 small radial engines to a standard production glider. The radials were actually made in occupied France and as such had little impact on German war production. About 130 of the type were made and proved useful in moving small numbers of troops or light vehicles over short distances. Using the same glider to power plane conversion, the massive Messerschmitt 323 was another attempt to maximize the Luftwaffe's airborne assets.
The Gigant, I saw the 4-engine version and the 6-engine version of the Gigant. In fact, I taxied the 6-engine version. It wasn't airworthy, but I taxied it just as a matter of interest. It was a vast airplane, called Wright, of course, and the one I taxied was the D model, and it had 6 Gnome-Rhone engines, and the 4-engine one had proved difficult, inadequate number of engines, and still had to have some assisted takeoff, such as JATO, or rocket assistance on takeoff. As pure gliders towed by aircraft like the Heinkel 111Z, and they were a failure, in my opinion. You had 3 Heinkel aircraft playing around with this, all the large Z, and all of them, the whole thing was a very dicey operation indeed. But once you got the 6-engine version going, it was practicable, but of course, it was a large, sluggish airplane.
Because of its great size and slow speed, the Me-323 was a sitting duck, and many were destroyed by the Allies. But when escorted by fighters, its ability to carry large loads was much valued by the Wehrmacht, especially in the mayhem that became the Eastern Front. Blohm & Voss built another remarkable transport aircraft, a long-range flying boat named the Viking. The BV-222 story is not unlike the Ju-90s. It was originally ordered as a commercial flying boat. However, as the war approached, the Viking evolved into a large military transport, which also performed some patrol duties. 6 powerful engines propelled the Viking. At first, they were fueled with gasoline,
But the BV-222 was intended to be refueled at sea by submarines. Since U-boats are driven by diesel, the practical solution was to convert the Viking to diesel engines. Blumenvoss had another prototype flying boat that was even more advanced. The BV-238 was designed to cope with harsher sea conditions than the Viking could handle. Working only with U-boats, it was expected to go on very lengthy missions. It was designed to be almost self-supporting and able to deal with many types of heavy cargo. To assist in loading the 238, it was equipped with a massive forward waterproof door in the bow. This could be employed in a similar manner to landing craft on a beachhead. What you see here is only a service hatch set within the waterproof door. To assist in handling cargo, there were derricks and winches located on the hull, making the BV-238 more like a merchant ship than an aircraft. There was also a tunnel which ran the length of both wings, providing internal access to the 6 engines, even when the flying boat was in the air. Only one BV-238 was completed. It was destroyed by Allied fighters just before the end of the war. The final example of Luftwaffe gigantism came in the form of the Junkers 390, a stretch 290 with a very capacious 110 feet long fuselage. Propelling this enormous aircraft would require 2 more engines than the Ju-290 and a much greater wing, over 160 feet in span. The extra wing length actually required an additional set of wheels on each side to support the craft as it landed. Only 2 Junkers 390s were ever built, but even these required enormous resources both in labor and material. After the war, only one of the Ju-390s was ever accounted for. This led to speculation as to what happened to the other aircraft, as the type had more range than any other German plane. When they already had a proven workhorse in the Ju-52, why did the Third Reich become so preoccupied with limited numbers of large transport aircraft? One possibility was that Germany had not prepared for a long war. The premise of Blitzkrieg was achieving quick victory by lightning attacks. The English Channel stymied Blitzkrieg against Britain. With the rapid fall of France, crossing the Channel became the Wehrmacht's primary objective. This could partially be achieved by gliders, which led to large transport planes like the Gigant. Often overlooked, there was one other design that evolved in the fatherland during those turbulent years: the Arado 232, sometimes called the millipede. Just after Germany invaded Poland, the Air Ministry issued a request for a replacement for the Ju-52. It must be equipped with a rear entry ramp and would employ 2 of the recently developed BMW 801 radial engines. Arado designers quickly came up with a brilliant design that embraced all the latest thinking in transport aircraft. It had a rear loading ramp, but unlike most other medium-sized transports of the time, it used a tricycle undercarriage. This type of wheel arrangement would not usually work in rough terrain. However, Arado engineers solved the problem by placing a row of small rollers under each side of the fuselage. If necessary, the main gear could be adjusted to kneel the plane down. The 232 would then simply crawl over obstacles on its many rollers, which led to its nickname, the millipede.
At the end of World War II, we were, of course, interested in bringing quite a lot of heavy stuff back from Germany, like wind tunnel gear and even airplanes. And we were looking for cargo planes. We used a German aircraft called the Arado 232, known as the millipede because of the large number of bogey fields that it had as part of its undercarriage layout. And this was a most effective system of operating on grass airfields, which abounded in Germany in the early stages, and where traction was very difficult to find under adverse weather conditions.
The Millipede's level loading ramp made it ideal for all types of cargo. But the Arado 232 had a major problem. It came in the form of this plane, the very successful Focke-Wulf 190, known as the Butcher Bird. The 190 used the same BMW 801 radial engines envisioned for the new Arado transport. After the German failure at the Battle of Britain, there was no doubt that the new FW-90 had priority for the BMW engines. The Arado would have to look elsewhere for suitable power plants, but there were none with the same power as the BMW 801. To solve this problem, a 4-engine millipede was proposed with a larger wing. This change led to delays. The end result was that possibly the best military transport of the Second World War was limited to a production run of less than 20 examples, leaving Auntie to soldier on alone. Eventually, almost 5,000 Ju-52s were made. Many continued to fly around the world for a number of years after the war, including some with the RAF. But Auntie was not their only Luftwaffe transport. 2 Arado 232 millipedes were also flown by the Royal Air Force. During the course of World War II, German aircraft designers embraced many unusual concepts. Some worked, but not all. The Blumenvoss P163, a product of the mind of Richard Vogt, a German aircraft designer who conceived of many weird and wonderful designs during World War II. At a time when the shortage of aluminum was starting to affect aircraft production, the P163 concept offered a way of partially utilizing steel as an alternative, at least in a limited way. Of course, there would be a weight penalty. However, the additional strength of steel might allow the wings to support a crew gondola and each wingtip, thereby allowing much more free space in the main fuselage for engines, weapons, and fuel. Each of the gondolas would have weighed about 1 ton. Vogt predicted that they would actually improve flight performance by reducing both bending in the wings and turbulence from their outer edges. Project 163 was envisioned as a high-speed bomber, fulfilling some of the multiple roles performed by the famous Junkers Ju-88. The Junkers plane was clearly in the fast bomber class. It had a crew of 3 or 4, grouped together to improve morale and enable better communication. However, the aircraft was lightly armed and relied mainly on speed for survival against enemy fighters. In contrast, the design of Blumenvoss's new proposal necessitated having 2 separate crew seating positions, separated by at least 60 feet. The 163 was manned by a crew of 4, with 2 men in each gondola. There would be a single pilot who would have a spectacular view, not disrupted by turning propellers. More significantly, the pilot sat back to back with his navigator and part-time gunner, who was in an excellent position to cover the rear and left flank of the aircraft. To balance the architecture, Project 163's other gondola had 2 gunners, one facing aft, the other forward. At least in theory, this high-speed bomber would have been very well protected.
Not surprisingly, there were serious concerns about the actual control of such a revolutionary layout. How would a pilot react to being at the very tip of an aircraft rather than the center? To test the impact of this position on the pilot, an early asymmetric Vogt design was modified. An additional gondola was added to the BV-141's port wing and tested. Another major advantage of the wingtip cockpit was that it would leave the 163's main fuselage less cluttered, leaving space for a power plant that consisted of two engines coupled together, driving counter-rotating propellers in a center-line thrust. At about the same time that Project 163 was being developed, the center-line thrust approach was also being explored in the south of Germany by the Dornier Company. Their DO-335 Arrow heavy fighter bomber design was also based on the principle of center-line thrust. One engine set in the traditional nose position, and another placed in the center of the fuselage, driving a propeller at the very back of the aircraft. In the United States, another company, Douglas Aircraft, were also engrossed in another center-line thrust project, which was just as revolutionary. The XB-42, or Mixmaster, was designed as a fast, long-range bomber. It employed two engines mounted near the middle of the airframe, driving separate propellers grouped together at the rear. The XB-42's layout, like that of the DO-335, resulted in extremely clean flying surfaces that made for increased speed and maneuverability. Both aircraft were finally made, and with testing so advanced, they probably would have gone into production if the war had continued. Meanwhile, back in Germany, the war was not going well, and the benefits of all new aircraft projects were being seriously reappraised. Although it was reasonable to assume that Blumenvoss had a design that would be the equal of the Junkers Ju-88 in speed and range, and it would also have offered considerably more defensive gunnery, there was still caution about the practicality of the crew positions. How would pilots feel about such an unusual design? The acid test would be the adapted 141 asymmetric plane. The standard BV-141 actually worked quite well. The addition of yet another gondola at the very tip of one wing made the aircraft even more bizarre looking, but it served its purpose and apparently proved that the wingtip cockpit arrangement was workable. However, workable just wasn't enough. Project 163 was cancelled before a prototype was built. There would be no armadas of this unusual-looking aircraft flying over enemy targets, and the addition of another gondola at the very tip of one wing did not turn it into a swan. But it served its purpose and apparently proved the wingtip cockpit arrangement was acceptable. Another factor behind the decision to cancel the 163 was its performance. It simply did not offer any major improvement on what was already proven and available. But performance was not Richard Vogt's primary objective in designing the 163. His goal was to find a way of substituting steel for aluminum, which at the time was in short supply. But as the war progressed, not only aluminum, but all materials in Germany were in short supply. But Richard Vogt's revolutionary concept would later be vindicated by the United States Air Force. In 1949, the Northrop F-89 Scorpion was finally selected by Air Defense Command as its mainstay all-weather interceptor. It was to be armed with cannons, but the A, B, and C models displayed structural problems in the wings, and there were some losses. In 1954, the D model entered service. This had a much strengthened wing and a huge pod mounted on both wing tips.
Each pod contained 52 Mighty Mouse rockets. The F-89D became the main production version of the Scorpion, and perhaps supported Vogt's theory on wing bending and turbulence. The post-war B-17 clearly demonstrated the benefits of Vogt's wingtip theory.
We had a B-17 there that had a crew position on the right wingtip. The reason they did that was to develop a central gun control. They had this on the B-29, however it wasn't on the wingtip, but that was what the airplane was built for. However, the war was over and everybody forgot about that, except the Aeromed people thought, oh, what a wonderful thing to find out what it is like to roll an airplane if you're not on the roll axis. Everybody said it didn't make any difference, but they insisted on doing it, and they built a cockpit in that position out there using the formation stick, which was worked through the autopilot, and you could fly the airplane from this position out on the wingtip. So I got to fly it. The one thing you did learn was, you know, when you're in turbulent air, you keep seeing the wings flap up and down. That's not exactly what's happening. The wings tips are more or less steady. It's the fuselage that's moving up and down. And you could sit out there on that wingtip and jiggle the formation stick longitudinally and make the people in the airplane sick, and you were hardly moving. But you didn't do it too much because they'd get mad at you and get even with you later.
In recognition of his genius, Richard Vogt was invited immediately after the war to work in America. He contributed to many designs, including the ambitious Tiptoe project and its many variants.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks' Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth, and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.